The humid dawn of 1856, Georgia settled like a heavy hand over the sprawling cotton estate known as the Plantation, where mist clung to the earth as though reluctant to rise, and where the rhythmic groans of waking labor already drifted from the slave quarters before birds dared greet the rising sun, and in the overseer's house perched on a slope overlooking fields worked into submission, like the people forced to tend them. 17-year-old Clara Whitford stood at her window, clutching the sill as the first light revealed rows of bowed silhouettes moving in exhausted obedience. Their bodies marked by years of Georgia heat and leather lash, their steps synchronized by fear rather than choice. And she wondered, as she often did, why the world below her window seemed built on the bones of prayers never answered. Clara had grown in the shadow of cruelty dressed as order, raised beneath the stern hand and sharper tongue of her father. Samuel Whitford, an overseer whose reputation stretched across the county, whispered not with respect but dread, for he ruled the Callahan lands with a brutality wrapped in scripture and defended by law, believing each strike of his whip to be a righteous act preserving divine hierarchy. And Clara had once accepted this as truth because daughters did not question fathers, and girls did not question a world designed by men who believed doubt was sin. But childhood innocence is not a permanent condition. It withers under the weight of what eyes are forced to witness. And Clara's began withering the first time she saw blood drip down the back of a boy, too small to understand the offense of falling behind in the field, and the image haunted her more fiercely with each passing year, until she no longer felt blessed to live on land so fertile and vast, but cursed to be tethered to a house built upon quiet screaming. Her mother, a fragile woman whose health had dissolved after birthing 3 children who never lived to see a second harvest, had once told her in hushed confession that God does not live in grand houses or gilded churches but in the cracks where mercy hides when men forget their humanity. And Clara, clutching those words like forbidden treasure, began to see things not as they were preached but as they truly stood. And the truth weighed on her like George's suffocating heat as she dressed that morning, pulling on her simple cotton gown, pinning her hair without vanity, aware that any beauty she possessed only brought her father's warning that a woman's virtue lay in silence, obedience, and maintaining distance from anything unpleasant, including the truth. She moved through the small house with quiet grace, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet, and paused outside her father's study where she heard the scrape of a chair and the low murmur of his voice reading scripture, though she suspected he cared more for power than salvation, for his prayers always seemed to ask not for mercy or guidance but for control, order, dominion. Outside, the sound of metal striking wood signaled the opening of the tool shed, followed by the rough bark of her father, commanding a field hand to hurry, his voice coated with the arrogance of one who believed the world existed for him to mold through fear. And Clara felt her stomach twist, a familiar churn that rose each time she heard pain masquerading as authority. Yet she had learned to hide her reactions. For Samuel Whitford possessed a keen sense for dissent, and a daughter showing softness toward enslaved people was not a daughter he recognized as his own, but a flaw to be corrected with force. So she kept her gaze lowered when he stomped past her, boots caked with dirt, pistol at his hip, whip coiled like a serpent ready to strike. Still, beneath her lowered lashes, she caught the restless flicker in his eyes, the jitter in his jaw, signs she had come to understand not as strength but as a man haunted by the violence he inflicted, losing himself to it with each sunrise. With him gone, the house exhaled its first breath of peace, and Clara stepped outside, letting the morning air carry its mixture of dew and smoke across her skin as enslaved children darted toward the well under the watchful eye of an older woman with hands calloused from years of grinding corn and washing linens not her own. And Clara caught the woman's eye, offering a small nod of acknowledgement not bold enough to be kindness yet too sincere to be mere habit, and in return she received a brief cautious nod, a connection heavy with understanding and distance, for boundaries carved by chains and law could not be crossed by gestures alone. She often watched the quarters when she could slip from her father's line of sight, studying the resilience woven into the routines of those forced to endure, their songs carrying histories she longed to understand but never heard fully, because they fell silent when she approached, not out of spite but survival, because trust was a luxury enslaved lives could not afford. Yet sometimes when she walked the edge of the cotton fields pretending to search for wildflowers, she listened to the whispered prayers rising from tired lips, prayers braided with names of ancestors stolen and hopes whispered into earth, and she wondered why God answered some prayers and not others, or whether the God her father served was not the same one they called to. She began to keep a notebook in secret, at first simply to sketch the landscape, the magnolia trees heavy with blooms, the river glimmering like polished steel beyond the distant pines. But soon she found her pencil trembling into truth, capturing moments she could not bear to forget. The welts on a woman's back shaped like broken branches, the hollow gaze of a man forced to watch his child punished, the quiet strength in the way they helped one another when overseers turned away, lifting burdens not just from shoulders but from spirits. The notebook became her confession, her rebellion in ink and graphite, hidden beneath loose floorboard planks where dust and silence guarded it. And on nights when her father returned with whiskey breath and blood on his boots, she held that notebook to her chest and prayed not to be brave, but to become worthy of the pain she witnessed yet could not stop. The catalyst arrived on a day smothered in heat so thick it seemed to press the sky lower. When a girl no older than Clara's own lost siblings collapsed beneath the sun, her body trembling, breath ragged, skin burning with fever and exhaustion, and Samuel Whitford demanded she rise, calling her lazy and sinful before raising his whip. But Clara, heart pounding like a drum of reckoning, stepped forward without thinking, grasping his wrist with trembling fingers and begging him, voice cracking, not to strike. Silence fell heavy as iron, dust hanging in the air like suspended judgment, and the enslaved workers froze as though the earth itself had stilled, watching a moment forbidden by every law and custom of their world. Her father's eyes turned on her, shocked, enraged, humiliated, and in that instant she understood the danger she had walked into. Yet something inside her refused to retreat, some spark lit by witnessing suffering too long without speaking, fueled by her mother's whispered wisdom and her own growing refusal to remain complicit in brutality, disguised as order. And when her father shoved her aside, eyes blazing with a fury that could not distinguish between disobedience and betrayal, she stumbled but did not fall, and the girl on the ground lifted her gaze toward Clara, with an expression carved from equal parts pain and bewildered gratitude. That night Clara's world tipped. She was locked in her room, denied supper, her father's voice booming through the floorboards as he spoke angrily with the plantation owner, Mr. Callahan, whose name carried as much weight in Georgia as any judge or militia captain, and she knew punishment was coming not just for her, but for the enslaved souls who dared witness her moment of defiance. For power never punished alone when it could punish many. She wept not from fear but from the knowledge she had crossed a line she could never step back over. And as moonlight traced pale bars across her floor, she opened her notebook and wrote not sketches but a promise, that she would expose every cruelty hidden beneath the veneer of Christian authority and agricultural nobility, that she would give voice to those silenced by chains and whip, that she would carry the truth even if it cost her family, safety, reputation, or breath itself. By morning she awoke with resolve settled like iron beneath fragile ribs, aware that the path before her was narrow and perilous, but aware also that remaining silent would be a sin far greater than any her father accused her of. And as she heard the first agonized cries rise from the fields where retribution began, she knew the reckoning had started not only on the plantation but within her own soul. The morning broke not with gentle dawn but with the jarring thud of consequences, as Clara heard the muffled cries carried through the open slats of her shuttered window, each anguished sound a blade sliding beneath her ribs, reminding her that her single act of defiance had not simply challenged her father. It had shaken the fragile equilibrium of an entire system built on silence and suffering. She pressed her palms to her ears, but flesh could not block truth. Every scream rising from the whipping post in the yard beyond the oak grove carried the weight of centuries of cruelty, and Clara felt as though the earth itself vibrated with grief, the dew trembling on grass like tears shed by a land forced to bear witness too long. The girl she had tried to protect, Lydia, she had learned from whispered scraps. Endured punishment meant not only for her perceived weakness but for the audacity of someone white having intervened, for power tolerated injury to the enslaved, but not interference in the machinery of its enforcement. Clara paced her room, skirts swishing against her ankles like whispers of guilt, eyes red from a night without rest, staring at the locked door that marked her confinement as punishment for compassion, viewed as rebellion, knowing that every second she remained helpless behind wooden walls, others bled for her courage. When at last the bolt scraped and the door swung open, her father's figure filled the doorway like an omen carved in flesh, jaw clenched tight, eyes flaring with a fury barely tamed by discipline, every line of his posture declaring war not only on those outside but on the daughter who had dared challenge him. He did not speak at first. He simply stared as though searching her face for signs of weakness, betrayal, or redemption, and Clara met his gaze with trembling resolve. Not because she felt brave, but because she refused to let fear smother the truth that had begun to bloom inside her like something alive and restless. "Oh, Whitford does not interfere with divine order," he finally hissed, and she resisted the urge to recoil at the way righteousness twisted into cruelty in his voice, transforming religion into a blunt instrument used to excuse what conscience should condemn. He dragged her outside by the wrist, forcing her into the glaring light of morning where heat clung to skin like accusation, and marched her toward the fields where enslaved workers bent shoulders under sacks heavy with cotton, their movements slow and strained as though the memory of Dawn's punishment still clung to their bones. He wanted her to see, to learn, to feel the weight of his authority. Punishment was not hidden here but performed as spectacle, a warning to black and white alike that power answered rebellion with pain. But as they walked past the whipping post, Clara's eyes fixed on the spot where dried, blood-stained wood darker than pine should ever be, and from the corner of her vision she saw Lydia seated on the dirt at the base of a tree, body trembling, shirt torn at the back, shoulders raw and glistening where skin had been split open. Their eyes met for a suspended second, and in that moment no law, race, or hierarchy existed. Only two young women bound by pain neither fully chose, one bleeding from lash, the other bleeding from awakening. Clara felt her father's grip tighten, as though sensing her thoughts, and he pulled her onward toward the main road where the plantation owner himself waited on horseback, posture regal, face carved into practiced neutrality that hid calculation more dangerous than overt rage. For men like Mr. Callahan enforced slavery not with crude force but with social and economic power that shaped counties like gods, shaping worlds. He greeted Samuel with a curt nod, eyes sliding toward Clara with cool scrutiny, taking in her pale face and clenched jaw, as if assessing whether she was a threat to be crushed or a wayward child who could be shaped back into compliance. "Your daughter," he said slowly, "must learn her place in the order the Lord ordained," his voice dripping false sanctity, so thick it made Clara's stomach churn as she wondered how many horrors had been justified beneath the veil of divine approval. Her father nodded vigorously, eager to prove his loyalty, and began speaking of discipline and correction. But Clara's mind wandered toward the fields where enslaved people picked cotton with trembling hands, each motion a testament to resilience forced by circumstance and maintained by the cruel mathematics of survival. She thought of Lydia, and the way pain carved defiance into her gaze. She thought of the elder woman at the well, whose quiet strength seemed carved from centuries. She thought of the children who played in dust that clung to their bare feet like the shadow of a future already stolen. Clara felt something shift inside her, not a burst of rebellion but a steady burning, a coal settling into the core of her being, fed by every injustice she saw yet could not unsee. Mr. Callahan's voice cut through her thoughts as he recited expectations for women in proper Christian households, emphasizing obedience, humility, and loyalty to family, church, and social order, each word like iron pressed onto her skin, branding her with the narrow mold she was expected to fit. Clara lowered her gaze, feigning humility while hiding the flame behind her lashes, and when the men finally dismissed her, she walked back to the house alone, not in defeat but in contemplation, each step stirring dust like whispers from those who had walked before her, those who resisted quietly because loud rebellion meant death but silence meant complicity. She spent the following days moving through her world like a ghost in her own life, speaking when required but mostly listening to the creak of wagon wheels carrying cotton to market, listening to the rustle of skirts as plantation wives gossiped over biscuits and tea about upcoming social gatherings, while ignoring the groans of bodies in fields outside their windows, listening to enslaved mothers hush their children at night, with lullabies shaped from sorrow and ancient beauty, melodies older than America, carried across stolen oceans like seeds hidden in braids. She observed her father returning each evening with weariness etched into his bones, not from labor but from the corrosive strain of maintaining dominance, as though cruelty consumed not only those who suffered under it, but those who wielded it. She noticed Callahan's visits growing more frequent, his gaze colder each time, suspicion lingering like smoke in the air, for a system built on oppression can smell dissent like wolves scent blood. And Clara, though outwardly compliant, began to collect knowledge like ammunition, names of families torn apart by auctions, whispered deaths covered as accidents or illness, records manipulated to hide punishment, letters hidden in drawers detailing shipments of shackles and chains. She stumbled upon account books listing not only cotton profits but purchase prices for human lives. Numbers cold and sharp, each digit a punch to her chest. Each name erased and replaced with descriptors like strong buck or breeding girl, reducing humanity to livestock terms that made her cry silently into her pillow at night. Praying not to the distant god of sermons and plantations, but to the quiet god of her mother's whispers, the one who listened to the oppressed in secret and held the unheard in his hands. Clara's notebook swelled with more than sketches now. Dates, observations, Bible verses twisted in sermons to justify domination, overheard conversations in which owners discussed punishing runaways, breeding enslaved women like cattle, or tracing ancestry to ensure purity of stock. She hid papers beneath floorboards like contraband scripture, knowing discovery meant ruin or worse, but truth once awakened refuses to lie dormant. It grows like wild vine breaking through foundation stones. One evening, while fetching water near the quarters, she saw a group of enslaved women gathered around Lydia, tending her wounds with salves made from herbs and lard, singing softly in a tongue Clara did not know, but that carried power that felt older than the soil beneath her feet. A language of grief and survival braided into melody, and Clara realized she was witnessing something sacred. Community forged in pain yet sustained by love, denied by their oppressors. Lydia lifted her eyes at Clara's presence, not in accusation but quiet curiosity, and Clara, throat thick, whispered a soft apology, though she knew words could not erase blood. The women paused, measuring her not by her skin or station but by intent in her gaze, and when one nodded imperceptibly, allowing her to stay a moment longer near that fragile circle of sisterhood, Clara felt included not as savior but as witness, humbled by resilience she had never been taught to honor. That night she returned home with her resolve sharpened like a blade beneath silk, and when she overheard her father planning to send Lydia south to a harsher plantation as example, she felt her breath stop, the room spinning as she realized truth without action is cowardice, and cowardice in the face of suffering becomes another form of violence. She waited until candles dimmed and footsteps ceased, heart pounding as she crept into his study, trembling fingers pulling open drawers to locate ledgers, letters, maps, anything proving systemic cruelty beyond one man's temperament. She found enough to burn reputations, enough to shake families who hid behind wealth and church pews, enough to reveal the rot beneath plantation gentility. She clutched the papers to her chest, eyes burning with tears she refused to shed, and whispered into the darkness that she would not allow power to harm Lydia or any other soul without consequence. She did not yet know how a girl with no voice in society could strike at giants built from blood-stained tradition, but she knew she would, and that her life, her safety, her family's standing were no longer enough to silence, the truth rising inside her like a river ready to flood. Clara spent the following days moving through the plantation as though she walked inside two realities at once, the one everyone else saw, orderly and prosperous with white men discussing crop yields and cotton prices on porches, while plantation wives embroidered linen and bragged about church charity, and the darker one she now perceived with painful clarity, hidden beneath polite conversation yet pulsing like an infection beneath skin, where every rustle in the cane fields was a stifled sob, every laughing planter's guest was a predator cloaked in gentility, every sermon about obedience another chain disguised as scripture, and she carried this dual vision like a weight pressing against her ribs, making it harder to breathe even as her outward composure sharpened into something unnervingly calm, because she knew panic would betray her, hesitancy would doom her, and to protect people whose names society refused to record, she needed to become someone her father and Mr. Callahan would never suspect. Silent, composed, dutiful. She attended supper each night, folding her hands in her lap as her father boasted about record cotton yields, pretending not to hear the hunger in the enslaved children's throats outside, endured the plantation owner's smug theories about the natural order of races, nodding politely while feeling bile rise with each word, and smiled when local ladies gossiped about upcoming balls in Savannah, even as she wondered how many of those women really knew, that in the barns behind their grand estates little girls were violated and little boys beaten until their bodies failed. And if they did know, what twisted thing allowed them to sleep at night, hearts untouched by horrors committed in God's name? She listened and waited, documenting each cruelty, each overheard conversation, each ledger entry confirming lives reduced to property lines, preparing her evidence like a quiet storm building behind clouded eyes. And every night she returned to her room to write by candlelight, hands shaking with fury and purpose, the flame flickering across pages filled with ink that felt like blood. Her father noticed the change eventually, not in her acts but in her silence, her unwavering composure, for cruelty senses when control begins to slip, even if the threat moves without sound. He watched her with suspicion growing like mildew in corners, questioning where she walked, whom she spoke to, why her eyes carried weight he could not decipher. And when he asked bluntly if she prayed for humility, she lowered her eyes and murmured, "Yes, Father," even as her heart murmured a different prayer, one for strength to dismantle everything he believed sacred. In that tense quiet, her opportunity arrived not through grand revelation but a simple accident. A visiting planter's son, arrogant and bored, struck a young enslaved boy across the face with a riding crop for no greater offense than being in his path. And when the child fell bleeding, Clara's father laughed with the other men, calling it discipline, while the boy's mother collapsed sobbing in the dust. Clara's nails dug crescent moons into her palms, and in that moment she realized waiting was not enough. Evidence alone would not change a world built on cruelty, for truth without a voice remained silent, and silence was what this land demanded above all. She made her decision that night, slipping from her room under moonlight thick as milk, clutching her hidden journal and the plantation records she had stolen, moving past sleeping servants and into the humid dark where cicadas cried like souls trapped in heat. She walked toward the quarter houses, heart pounding as dogs barked in the distance and an owl hooted from the tree line. Not knowing exactly who she sought, but certain she could not continue alone, near the cookhouse she saw a small fire flickering low. A circle of enslaved women huddled around a washtub, whispering lullabies and rubbing ointment on Lydia's still raw back. Clara approached slowly, trembling not from fear of them but from fear of failing them. And when one woman turned sharply, lifting a hand in instinctive defense, Clara knelt in the dirt and lowered her gaze, the reversal of expected posture speaking louder than any words could. The air hung heavy with suspicion, confusion, the rustling of brittle leaves, and for a long heartbeat no one moved. No one breathed. Then, in a voice soft as worn cloth, Clara whispered, "I can't stop them alone." The oldest woman in the group, her back bent with decades of picking cotton under Georgia sun, studied Clara with eyes like flint and river water, hard but alive, and asked nothing. Instead, she simply nodded once, and the circle parted enough for Clara to sit near the edge of the firelight. Lydia lifted her head slowly from where she lay wrapped in cloth, pain etched deep into her features, and Clara felt her throat tighten with grief and shame and determination braided together like strands of rope. She placed her journal on the ground before them, a silent offering, opening pages filled with dates, descriptions, names, ledgers, blood-inked truths no white court would accept unless they came from white hands, and even then only if that hand wielded it like a weapon. The women exchanged looks filled with centuries of caution, but one spoke, a whisper, trembling but firm. "Words don't stop whips." Clara swallowed, voice shaking as she answered, "But they can expose the hand holding it." Silence again, thick as swamp air, until a young mother spoke up, braiding her daughter's hair as she murmured, "Exposed to who? They all the same." And Clara realized exposing wickedness to the wicked meant nothing, but exposing it where power could no longer hide might change everything. She revealed her plan in hushed tones. There were abolitionist newspapers in the North, secret mail routes through sympathetic ministers and traveling merchants, whispers of networks that helped enslaved people flee northward. If she could get the documents out, if she could get testimony recorded and truth carried beyond Georgia soil, the Callahan plantation could fall. Her father could fall. Maybe even the system itself could crack in places thicker than wood beams and brick chimneys. It was a desperate plan, dangerous in every direction. She could be arrested, institutionalized, or quietly disappeared, and so could anyone helping her. But the women listened, and in their silence she heard something stirring. Not trust yet, but recognition that desperation and courage sometimes walk the same path. They did not offer hands or promises, but they did not turn away either. And in that fragile stillness, Clara felt a quiet alliance form, not born of affection, but shared necessity. She returned to the house before dawn, skirts damp with dew, the first light rounding the horizon like a witness stirring from sleep. Her father waited on the porch, pistol laid casually on the table beside him, rocking chair creaking as he studied her with the calculating gaze of a man who sensed rebellion, but could not yet see its shape. "Up early," he remarked, tone casual but taut, and Clara forced a calm breath, murmuring something about air for her thoughts. He narrowed his eyes but let her pass, though fear curled in her chest like barbed wire. She knew suspicion was no longer sleeping but pacing the doorway of his mind. The next days unfolded with terrifying quietness, tension tightening like a stretched rope. Clara moved carefully, cataloging cruelty, stealing moments to slip papers to the washwoman who agreed to help deliver them to a traveling preacher rumored to despise slavery in his bones. Each exchange was a dance with death, each glance from her father a hammer-testing stone for weakness. And then it happened. A missing ledger, a misplaced note discovered beneath the wrong drawer, a careless servant repeating that Miss Clara had been wandering near the quarters at night. Small things, but small things build thunder. Things build thunder. Samuel Whitford stormed into her room before supper, face flushed not with wine but suspicion hardened into certainty, and demanded to know what she was hiding. Clara steadied herself, the weight of the truth she carried heavy enough to crack bone, and spoke carefully, knowing lies would drown her and honesty might kill her. She did not deny wandering. She said only that she prayed with the enslaved, that her conscience felt heavy and required God's comfort. Her father stared long, searching for cracks, and though doubt lingered in his eyes like storm clouds, he left with a grunt, muttering about women's fragile minds and religious hysteria. Clara exhaled only when he was gone, shaking so violently she had to collapse onto her bed, hands pressed to her mouth to keep sobs silent. She realized then that she would not survive long in secrecy. Sooner or later her father would uncover everything and truth would die with her. So she made her choice. She would accelerate her plan, send every document north within days, and prepare for the reckoning that would inevitably follow. Night fell again, thick and watchful, and Clara lit her candle, ink trembling at the tip of her quill as she wrote a final entry. If God demands silence in the face of suffering, then God is not just. And if society demands obedience to injustice, then disobedience is the only holy act. She blew out the flame and pressed her forehead to the cool wood floors, breathing through fear so sharp it felt like knives under her ribs. Outside, the wind rustled the cotton fields with the uneasy sigh of a world shifting. Somewhere a dog barked, somewhere a child cried, somewhere chains clinked as exhausted bodies turned in restless sleep. And in the hush between those sounds, Clara felt something vast awaken, not hope, not peace, but a terrible, sacred resolve. The storm did not announce itself with thunder or rain, but with silence thick enough to choke, the kind of silence that settles before a gun is drawn or a truth is uncovered, and Clara felt it pressing against her ribs as dawn rose gray and hesitant. The plantation unusually still except for the restless rustling of birds, startled by a shift in the air only instinct could read. She moved through her morning routine with rigid composure, fingers trembling as she buttoned her dress, aware that each gesture, each breath, might be weighed by eyes, waiting to confirm suspicion. Downstairs, her father sat at the table, not eating but staring into a mug of black coffee, fingers drumming on wood with slow, deliberate rhythm. It was the sound of calculation, not of hunger, and Clara felt sweat beat at her spine despite the cool morning. He lifted his gaze to her with a smile too still to be genuine, and she forced her own to remain steady, offering a polite greeting while her pulse hammered like a trapped bird in her throat. He asked nothing, and she answered nothing. The silence between them stretched taut, each aware that a fragile facade was cracking. Outside, field labor had begun, the rhythmic swish of cotton sacks and soft murmur of weary voices rising like a subdued chant. But today the enslaved workers moved with unease, eyes shifting toward the house as though they sensed danger building inside its walls, as though they had seen enough of life to recognize when violence gathered like storm clouds. Clara slipped out under pretense of fetching herbs for the kitchen, grateful for air that did not taste like accusation, and hurried toward the garden path that curved near the quarters, where she hoped to pass one last bundle of papers, before her father's suspicions solidified into action. But as she approached, she heard a noise behind her, the sharp crunch of boot against gravel, and froze, heart pounding. Samuel Whitford's voice came low and steady behind her, a serpent in scripture tone. "Clara, step inside." She turned slowly, masking fear through will alone, and followed him into his study, the door closing like a coffin lid behind them. He did not sit. He stood rigid, whip hanging from the wall like a silent threat, Bible open on the desk as if morality itself had been summoned to witness judgment. He asked where she had been at night. He asked why she wandered near slave cabins. He asked why ledgers were missing pages, why servants whispered her name, why she seemed troubled by matters not fit for a young lady's mind. Each question was a blade, and she answered with careful half-truths, speaking of prayers and compassion and Scripture's command to care for the suffering. His face tightened like rope pulling taut, eyes narrowing into slits of suspicion and authority. He called compassion a weakness, a danger, a disease that spread rebellion like fever, and told her the Lord commanded roles be kept, masters and servants, strength and submission, men and women. Clara's voice trembled as she replied that mercy was not rebellion, but the flicker of rage in his eyes told her that to him they were the same. He lunged suddenly, gripping her wrist with a force that made her gasp, pulling her journal from her apron pocket. Pages fluttered to the floor like fallen birds, exposing sketches of scarred backs, notes of cruelty, ledger entries copied in delicate strokes, evidence like kindling in the wrong hands. He threw the notebook against the wall, jaw pulsing with fury, demanding to know whose lies had poisoned her, and Clara knew pleading would only deepen suspicion. So she lifted her chin, breath shallow but steady, and answered softly that she had opened her eyes. He struck her, not with whip but with the back of his hand, a blow sharp enough to knock her to the floor. Copper taste filling her mouth, tears burning but unshed. Her father paced like a beast caged by its own authority, muttering about corruption, danger, the devil in soft hearts, the peril of letting women think beyond household walls. He lifted her by the arm and dragged her outside into glaring sun, pulling her toward the quarters where enslaved workers paused mid-task, eyes widening in shock and dread as they saw the overseer shove his own daughter into dirt before them. He accused her of fraternizing, of undermining order, of betrayal against her blood, and Clara tasted earth as humiliation pressed into her skin, watching enslaved families avert their eyes not out of indifference but terror, that witnessing her punishment might draw lashes on their backs. Samuel shouted for a rope, for confinement, for correction. He intended to lock her until obedience replaced conviction or madness did. But Mr. Callahan arrived before rope could tighten. The plantation owner's expression chilled the air more than any winter breeze. His lips pressed into a line of calculated control, eyes gliding over Clara's dirt-streaked form with a condescending pity reserved for women, too fragile to bear responsibility, and too dangerous to be ignored. He ordered Samuel to release her, not from mercy but pragmatism. A scandal ruins crops faster than blight, he murmured, and Clara felt a tremor of disgust, her fate debated in crop metaphors. He commanded that Clara be sent to Savannah to stay with an aunt, framed as restoration of feminine propriety, but meant to remove her from danger and scrutiny before any whisper spread. Samuel nodded reluctantly, fury simmering beneath obedience, and Clara knew with icy clarity that being sent away might save her life, but would bury every truth she meant to expose unless she acted before nightfall. As she was escorted back to the house, she passed Lydia in the yard. Their eyes met briefly. Clara bruised, Lydia scarred, two young women bound by invisible chains of different shapes, and in Lydia's gaze Clara saw no pity, only fierce urging, a silent mandate. Finish it. That afternoon, as trunks were packed and servants whispered speculation, Clara stole moments to slide her remaining documents into the lining of a satchel, hands shaking with urgency. She sought the cookhouse one last time, pressing a small envelope into the hands of the washwoman who had aided her, murmuring instructions thin as thread. Give this to the preacher, tomorrow at dawn, no sooner. No sooner. The woman squeezed her hand once, eyes fierce, the kind of solidarity forged in fire and sorrow. Dusk bled across fields as Clara prepared to leave the only home she had ever known, her father pacing porch boards like a jailer guarding guilt. When darkness settled, she slipped out once more, not toward the quarters but toward the edge of the woods where fireflies blinked like signals. She had arranged a final meeting with a man who delivered sermons by day and news to abolitionists by night. He waited beneath the cedar tree, hat in hand, posture solemn. She handed him her packet, notes, copies, her testimony, a plea for investigation, and whispered, "Carry truth farther than I can." He nodded, tucking it inside his coat, solemn as a soldier tasked with sacred burden. When she returned, her father was waiting in the doorway, shadow long and sharp behind him. He said nothing, simply ushered her inside, and Clara felt the door close like judgment. She lay awake until moonlight crept across the floor, listening to the plantation breathe, rustle of leaves, distant cry of whippoorwills, quiet murmurs from cabins where mothers soothed children the world refused to protect. Fear gnawed at her, but beneath it pulsed a strange peace. She had acted. Truth was moving beyond fences and fields, carried by hands stronger than chains. As sleep threatened, she imagined Lydia healing, children running without dread, land no longer soaked in suffering. She did not know if any of it would come in her lifetime, but she had pushed the first stone down a hill history would someday recognize, and in that fragile certainty she allowed her eyes to close, unaware that while she slept her father sat outside her door, pistol across his lap, wrestling not with God but with the terror that control had slipped from his grasp forever. Dawn crept into Clara's final morning on the plantation, not as gentle blessing but as a pale, watchful witness, its dim light revealing a house suspended between ordinary routine and silent catastrophe. Because truth once loosed into the world does not sit quietly. It circulates like wind through rafters, unsettling dust that hoped never to be disturbed. She woke with a start, breath ragged, heart heavy with the knowledge that today she would be removed, exiled under the guise of propriety. And though she had acted, though she had passed the evidence into hands beyond her father's reach, dread pooled in her stomach like river silt, thick and impossible to shake. For she also understood that the machine of plantation power rarely allowed threats to drift away untouched, and men like Samuel Whitford did not permit defiance to leave roots in their soil. She dressed slowly, limbs aching as though weighted by memory, each motion accompanied by steady breathing, learned from nights when fear clawed her insides. And when she looked in the mirror, she hardly recognized the face staring back, bruised cheek gone faintly yellow, eyes no longer naive but shadowed by knowledge and resolve. She tied her bonnet with fingers steadier than she felt because fear could rattle bones, but she would not allow it to shatter her spirit. Outside, the wagon waited beside the wide porch where her childhood steps once played, the same wooden boards that now looked like gallows, creaking under her father's boots as he paced in restrained fury, the pistol no longer in hand but visible through his coat, a silent reminder that protection and threat were indistinguishable in his grasp. He did not offer blessing or warmth, only a curt instruction that she sit quickly, his voice tight with pride wounded deeper than skin, for in his mind she had betrayed lineage, order, and him all at once, and though he would rather die than admit fear, Clara saw it trembling beneath his anger, a man terrified that the world he controlled through violence was slipping from his grasp by the quiet rebellion of a girl once taught to curtsy. Workers in the yard paused as she passed, hats lowered, faces expressionless outwardly but eyes holding something harder to decode. Caution, sorrow, and beneath it a spark of something that felt achingly close to respect, though neither side dared acknowledge it, because in this society even glances were policed like contraband and empathy was dangerous currency. Lydia stood near the well, posture stiff but upright despite scarred back still healing, eyes meeting Clara's one final time. No words crossed that space, but a silent understanding did. Pain had been witnessed, truth had been carried, and though their fates diverged now, their alliance was written not in ink but in wound and witness. As the wagon began to roll, the wheels grinding over red clay, Clara turned once more to imprint the land in her memory, the looming house built on blood and pride, the endless rows of cotton trembling in the morning breeze like white shrouds, the tall oaks heavy with Spanish moss that looked like centuries of sorrow draped across ancient limbs, the slave quarters small and weather-worn, doors opening with slow curiosity as families peeked out to watch the overseer's daughter depart. Under circumstances they couldn't name but sensed as rupture, Samuel stood rigid, jaw clenched, hands behind his back as though restraining the urge to seize control physically. And Clara knew without him speaking that his rage would not rest quietly, that his authority, publicly shaken, demanded reassertion somewhere, and she feared for the bodies that would bear the punishment meant for her absence. That knowledge twisted inside her like thornvine, and she swore silently that if she survived Savannah, she would not remain silent or distant, but would ensure the truth reached every abolitionist hand it needed to ignite action. The wagon moved past the fields where cotton glowed pale against morning sun, and Clara remembered childhood lessons, how overseers measured profit by weight of sacks, how children as young as 5 picked cotton until fingers bled, how women stitched wounds together at night because doctors would not waste salves on enslaved bodies, how runaways were chased with dogs whose training began with scraps of clothing ripped from those captured before. Today those details cut sharper than ever. because she now understood they were not simply cruel chapters of others' lives. They were the foundation of everything she had been raised to believe was privilege and order. And knowing that made her privilege feel like theft, her comfort a debt she could never repay except through relentless truth-telling. The wagon reached the crossroads where pine forest swallowed the road to Savannah, and Clara inhaled deeply, the thick scent of sap and earth grounding her as she prepared to step into unfamiliar world. The driver, hired for the journey, tipped his hat, unaware or uncaring of the hurricane hidden beneath her bonnet ribbons. As they traveled, the plantation shrank behind trees, but it did not fade from her. It lingered like heat on skin long after noon, burning memory into bone. The landscape rolled by in haunting stillness, fields giving way to marshland, cicadas droning, sun climbing with oppressive insistence, Spanish moss swaying like funeral veils, beautiful and suffocating at once, a contradiction like the South itself. Clara's mind churned, replaying each step of her secret mission, each lifetime compressed into weeks, awakening, witnessing, gathering, risking, acting, and she wondered whether doubt would come now that distance softened edges of fear. But instead she felt a hollow ache of urgency, because she knew she had moved too slowly already, that every minute the plantation existed unchanged meant another back scarred, another child sold, another Lydia punished for breathing. She clutched her satchel tight, though most papers were gone now, carried by the preacher toward northern presses. Still she held her journal, empty pages yet to be filled with testimony she intended to gather from Savannah, from witnesses, from voices silenced by place but not by truth. She imagined abolitionists reading her words, northern lawmakers ignoring them, southern elites hunting the source, whispers spreading, names exposed like raw nerve. And though fear tightened her throat, it could not extinguish the flame that had ignited inside. Because once injustice becomes personal, courage is no longer choice but consequence. Hours passed before they stopped at a small roadside inn, whitewashed walls cracked from humidity, porch sagging, chickens pecking at dust while a mule brayed somewhere out back. Clara stepped down stiffly, body numb from travel and emotion, and as she entered the dining room she felt eyes on her. Not hostile, merely curious as travelers glanced up from plates of cornbread and ham. But in the corner sat a man who watched differently. Sharp gaze, jaw set, hat brim pulled low, posture too rigid for a weary traveler, and instinct prickled along Clara's spine like cold wind. She sat far from him, hands steady as she sipped water. Yet every sense stayed alert. When she rose to leave, she caught the faintest flicker of movement as he stood too, roughly timed to hers, and suspicion hardened into certainty, like wet clay fired into brick. She re-entered the wagon quickly, pulse racing, and murmured to the driver to move on. He looked confused but obeyed, and as they pulled away, Clara dared glance back. The man had emerged from the inn, watching the wagon depart, hands clasped, behind him in a posture eerily similar to her father's when planning discipline. She swallowed fear with stubborn resolve, refusing to let panic rule. Surveillance meant she had struck hard enough to matter. The road wound on, sunlight slanting golden across tall grass as afternoon deepened, and Clara turned her mind toward Savannah, imagining bustling ports, abolitionist whispers hidden among church halls and merchant houses, opportunities to carry her testimony wider. Yet even as she dreamed of justice, another shadow pressed against her thoughts. Lydia, the women, the children she left behind, whose bodies might bear retribution meant for her absence. And she clenched the satchel as though holding their fate in her fist, whispering promises into the wind that she would not fail them. Evening approached, cicadas rising in shrill chorus, and the driver suggested stopping for the night. But Clara insisted they push forward until moonlight, unwilling to linger in spaces where danger might sit quietly in shadowed corners. Fireflies blinked like scattered stars as night settled, cloak of humidity thickening, and the wagon lantern cast trembling glow over rutted road while owls called ghost-like from trees. Clara rested her head lightly against the wooden side, exhaustion threading through determination, and whispered a vow into darkness, that no matter the cost, she would carry the truth until the world either heard it or destroyed her for speaking it, because silence now would be complicity, and she had already shed the skin of the girl bred to obey. In the distance far behind, lightning flickered faintly over Georgia pines, Heat lightning with no rain. Sign of storm forming slowly. Building pressure unseen yet inevitable. The kind of storm that breaks not weather but worlds. And Clara, staring into night, understood she had become part of that storm. Savannah announced itself not with celebration, but with the weight of civilization layered atop brutality. Cobblestone streets echoing with carriage wheels and merchant boasts while the river breathed steam and sweat into the air, ships rising and sinking under the command of men trading cotton, rice, indigo, and human lives, all with the same ledger stroke. And as Clara stepped from the wagon into the bustling port city, she felt both smaller and more dangerous than she ever had, a single thread entering a tapestry that shimmered with gentility on top and rotted underneath where commerce fed on flesh. Her aunt's home stood grand among the live oaks, wide columns white as bleached bone, draped in moss that fell like mourning veils. And when the heavy brass knocker fell against the wood, the door opened to reveal a woman refined and brittle as porcelain, eyes assessing Clara as though she were a vase shipped from abroad and possibly chipped. Her aunt made no mention of rumors, only spoke of delicate nerves and proper routine, ushering Clara into a drawing room flooded with lace and whispers, where young ladies embroidered quietly and older matrons exchanged notes on church bazaars and marriage prospects while servants moved unseen except when summoned. Clara felt suffocated by politeness, by fragility used as armor against reality, by the genteel avoidance that masked Savannah's reliance on slave labor more than any rural farm ever could. And though she folded her hands and lowered her gaze, as expected, inside her mind she mapped escape routes, coded letters, and potential allies. She noticed everything. The enslaved butler whose eyes flicked up only once to meet hers, long enough for her to recognize exhaustion buried beneath practiced stillness. The tea tray carried by hands that trembled slightly, not from age but lack of rest. The chill her aunt's voice carried whenever the topic of troublesome abolitionists surfaced, the way the other young women flinched when their husbands or brothers spoke sharply, proving obedience was demanded in every direction, on this soil, not only downward. That first night she lay awake in an unfamiliar feather bed, ceiling high above like the sky itself had been built indoors, and she listened through open window shutters to the distant wails of river laborers unloading cotton bales under torchlight, voices rough with fatigue, the splash of water and rattle of chains traveling on humid air like phantom hymns. She held her journal open, but hesitated, for her mission had reached a point where careful steps mattered more than passionate words. And one slip here among Charleston merchants, parlor gossips, and Confederate sympathists would erase the movement she had sparked. Days in Savannah unfolded with deceptive normalcy. Luncheons, church services where pastors prayed for prosperity and God's ordained order, evening promenades along the river where wealthy men pointed at auction blocks with casual familiarity, speaking of market prices while ignoring the dark stain where barefoot mothers once stood trembling with infants torn from arms. Clara's hands stayed folded, but her eyes roamed, absorbing cruelty masked as civility, memorizing faces of traitors and clergy, every detail fueling the fire she tended like a sacred lamp inside her chest. Yet shadows followed her. A feeling at first, like eyes on the back of her neck, then a certainty as she spotted the man from the roadside inn lingering near a bakery one morning, then again outside the church steps, his hat brim low and posture stiff, and she knew he was no coincidence nor business traveler but an embodiment of the South's instinct to hunt threats to its power. Still, she did not falter. She wrote each night by candlelight, careful letters tucked into stitching of her dress hem, coded language only abolitionists would understand, and delivered them discreetly to a sympathetic bookseller she identified by the abolitionist sermon, pages hidden beneath a religious tract, his brief nod confirming alliance without ever speaking the word. Meanwhile, she attended teas where women whispered about rumored uprisings miles inland, fear masked as indignation that these people did not know their place. And Clara learned more about the machinery of slavery in those polite gatherings than from any overseer's journal, who owned the biggest trading houses, which judges suppressed manumission petitions, which pastors lectured enslaved congregants about obedience, which legislators quietly profited from smuggling shipments. After foreign import bans, she cataloged all of it, building a network not of accomplices but of truths, threads that when pulled might unravel reputations and laws. But beneath the surface progress, dread coiled like a serpent. Her father had not yet acted, but silence from the Callahan plantation could never mean safety, only brewing reckoning. And indeed, it came in the form of a letter delivered 3 weeks after her arrival, its seal cracked by trembling fingers, the ink inside terse. A runaway reported, unrest brewing, punishment administered, property secure, written in her father's clipped hand as if flogging humans warranted no more emotional weight than repairing fences. And between the lines she saw it, unspoken but clear. Lydia had been taken. Not killed, not yet, but taken to a broker for transport south to the deep Florida frontier, where sugar fields devoured souls faster than cane knives cut green stalks. Clara's breath broke like thin glass, and she clutched the letter as if holding Lydia's body, grief and rage meeting in her chest so fiercely she choked. This was retribution not only for her disobedience, but a message, a warning that her actions had consequences others bore, and for a moment, terror nearly drowned conviction. She left the house without bonnet or gloves, walking fast through humid streets until she reached the river, leaning over railing as ships creaked and gulls cried above, trying to breathe through the storm inside. Tears fell silently, salt mixing with river air, but when they dried her face hardened not into despair but into resolve carved deeper. If Lydia was taken, then Clara would follow the paper trail, expose the sale, trace the ownership transfer, gather testimonies from wherever Lydia landed, and if she survived, one day publish it for northern newspapers to devour, turning one woman's suffering into indictment of a system. She returned home with steel in her spine and resumed her careful routine, but now each step carried sharper urgency. Her letters north became more detailed, her tone less cautious, her list of names longer. One evening, returning from a charitable sewing circle meant to stitch clothing for needy white families, she overheard her aunt speaking in hushed tones to a visiting relative, the words chilling. Samuel is half mad from embarrassment. He suspects outside agitation. She must be restored before she damages us. Clara realized then that exile was not a shield. It was a pause, a temporary relocation before they tried to suffocate her rebellion through marriage to a loyal, cruel man or confinement under guise of hysteria, a fate many Southern women met when opinions bloomed in minds forbidden to think. She could not remain here long. She needed escape north before family tightened grip. But escape as a Southern white woman carried risk, suspicion, questions. So she built another plan, layered and quiet. She befriended a Northern doctor's wife in town, one whose gentle voice masked sharp intellect and subtle abolitionist sympathies, hinted in the way she asked Clara careful questions about plantation life. Through tea conversations and coded comments, Clara discovered the woman's brother operated a safe route toward Philadelphia, disguised as medical shipments leaving port. She arranged a meeting discreetly at the doctor's office, where shelves of glass jars and scalpels glinted like instruments of truth, and they spoke only a few words but enough. A departure in 2 weeks. One traveler. Disguise arranged. Clara returned to her aunt's house with calm smile, answering supper prayers with serenity that concealed her plan to disappear like smoke, because she knew she could not continue the fight from polished prison halls. She belonged among those pushing history, not those preserving decay. But danger sharpened. The man who shadowed her stepped closer now, appearing outside shops she entered, trailing behind at church, his gaze not curious, but hunting. She responded by weaving her movements like thread through a loom, never direct, never predictable, always watching reflections in shop windows, footsteps on stone. She wrote a final long document one night, detailing not only her testimony but full names, locations, ledgers, dates, a map of the Callahan plantation, names of overseers known for cruelty across counties, even her father's business ties. When finished, she sealed it in wax and hid it in the false bottom of her satchel, along with a second copy tucked into the cover of a hymnal she planned to leave with the doctor's wife. If she vanished, the truth would not. If she survived, she would carry it herself. Sleep grew scarce, replaced by watchfulness. Food lost taste, replaced by determination. And each night when she closed her eyes, she saw Lydia's torn back, the washwoman's steady gaze, children clutching scrap dolls, and her younger self oblivious to all of it, dancing through summers under magnolia branches while others labored until bones ached. She would not allow innocence to return, nor would she permit regret to paralyze. She lived now not for comfort but for justice, and justice rarely sleeps softly. The days counted down like heartbeat ticks, each one closing the gap between captivity and flight, each one tight with danger like a rope pulled taut. And the closer she came to departure, the more shadows pressed in, until even light felt like interrogation. Yet her resolve never wavered. She had already crossed the threshold where fear commands obedience. Now fear only fueled commitment. And so, as the night of her escape drew near, Savannah hummed with its usual veneer of civility, unaware that a young woman in a lace-trimmed bedroom upstairs was not preparing a society gown, but sharpening her testimony like a blade, ready to cut through the fabric of Southern silence, even if it cost her every last breath she possessed. Night arrived not quietly, but like a held breath-breaking, humid air thick with the scent of river silt and magnolia, gas lamps flickering along Savannah's narrow streets as if afraid of the dark they pierced, and in the guest room where lace, curtains shivered in the faint breeze. Clara stood fully dressed with her satchel strapped beneath her cloak, heart pounding not with doubt but with the terrible clarity of someone stepping out of one world and into another by choice, knowing both the danger of staying and the danger of going. Her hands trembled only once when she paused at the window and saw the live oaks outside swaying like ancient sentinels who had watched too many women disappear into silence, and too many men enforce it. Downstairs, the house slept under the illusion of safety and order, her aunt dreaming the fragile dream of Southern womanhood untouched by conscience, the servants resting in quarters behind the kitchen after a day of labor invisible to polite conversation, and Clara moved quietly through hallway shadows, shoes in hand to mute her steps, pulse echoing in her ears like the heavy drums of a funeral procession, as she descended the stairs one careful inch at a time. When she reached the back door, her fingers hesitated on the latch, not from fear of leaving, but from fear of what return meant, because leaving meant breaking not only physical boundaries, but the social blood vow expected of her as a daughter of plantation culture. It meant choosing conscience over lineage, humanity over homeland, truth over safety. And her throat tightened at the realization that even if she survived this night, she could never again belong anywhere untouched by moral stain. For once truth is seen, innocence is not simply lost but intentionally surrendered. She slipped outside, night air hitting her like baptism and burial at once, cicadas crying from hidden branches and river fog rising low across the ground like the breath of unseen witnesses. She followed the narrow garden path to the gate, where the doctor's wife had instructed her a wagon would wait disguised as medical delivery. But as she turned the final corner, lantern light flared from behind the stable wall, and a figure stepped into view. The same man who had watched her across, Miles and Weeks, hat brim low, features cold with certainty, body rigid with the authority of men sanctioned by law and violence. His hand lifted not in greeting but in command, palm raised to stop her, and though he spoke no words, the threat lay in posture alone. Return or be taken. Clara's chest rose with one sharp breath, then steadied. She did not flee, did not flinch, but stood tall, chin lifted just enough to show she understood exactly what was happening and still refused surrender. The man reached for her arm, a gesture practiced, efficient, confident in his power. Yet before his fingers closed, a second figure emerged from darkness at his back, the doctor himself, appearing as though from the mist, one hand gripping a walking cane carved from ironwood, eyes firm with conviction that had simmered quietly beneath medical calm until now. In a single, swift movement, he placed the cane between the man and Clara, and spoke low, urgent words not meant to persuade but to warn, soundless to all but those inches from him. Whatever rationale he offered, it was enough to stall violence if only for a breath. The man hesitated, scanning the doctor's face, calculating risk and witness and timing. Hesitation born not from mercy but strategy. And in that sliver of time, the doctor motioned toward the alley behind the carriage house. Clara moved, steps fast but controlled, cloak trailing like shadow, and she slipped into the narrow passage where moonlight could not penetrate, fingers tightening around the satchel that held her truth, her weapon, her burden. The wagon waited behind the apothecary, horse stamping impatiently, lantern shuddered for secrecy. The doctor's wife stood beside it, shawl pulled low, whispering a prayer not for safety but for strength, because women who fight power learn not to hope for mercy. Clara climbed inside, breath tight in her chest, and the wagon rolled before she finished settling beneath the crates labeled, "Medical Supplies Fragile." Through slats, she watched the doctor return to face the man in the hat, watched tension flicker between them like lightning caged behind clouds, watched the man finally turn and walk briskly toward the main street, certainty of pursuit not broken but delayed. The wagon clattered through cobbled lanes, wheels ringing against stone like the beat of history accelerating. They passed the riverfront where torches still burned beside stacked cotton bales, enslaved stevedores moving like shadows under overseer's watch, and Clara's eyes filled with burning mixture of grief and fury, not only for those suffering now but for ancestors never mourned, for futures forced to fight yet unborn. City gave way to outskirts, lanterns thinning, road softening to dirt, and the wagon picked up speed, hooves striking rhythm into the earth. Once they reached the marsh road, the driver offered a curt nod, signal that danger lessened but not gone, and Clara finally let herself breathe. Not relief, but readiness. The plan was not finished. Savannah was only the first gate. From here she would travel north by a network hidden in hymn books and coded letters, posing as a nurse sent to assist with cholera treatment, her satchel of incriminating documents tucked in false bottom beneath linen and tinctures. She imagined reaching Charleston quietly, then Wilmington, then by coastal packet boat to Philadelphia, where the packets of truth she carried would be placed into hands capable of turning whispered injustice into printed indictment. Names exposed, plantation records published, lies shattered by testimony carved from blood and witness. But the journey ahead meant danger stalking every mile, bounty hunters sniffing rumor, family influence stretching like roots through every southern court. Men like Samuel Whitford who would declare madness before they allowed disobedience to spread like contagion among white daughters. And she knew too that North was not a promised land without cruelty, only a battleground where truth at least had room to breathe, where she would join those who fought in newspapers, lecture halls, church basements, households whispering rebellion over candle flame. As the night road stretched before her, the wagon rocking over the uneven path, memories of the plantation surged like ghosts summoned by movement. Lydia's torn flesh and unbroken gaze, the quiet strength of women singing over wounds, the little boy struck by the riding crop, the ledger listing children sold before they could speak, the enslaved men laboring by moonlight, the washwoman's steady eyes as she took the evidence, her father's shaking fury, the Bible lifted as a weapon rather than sanctuary, the land itself heavy with centuries of unburied grief. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling not just heartbeat but history pulsing beneath ribs, and whispered nothing aloud, because promise lived in action now, not speech. Hours passed, stars turning cold and bright overhead, and somewhere behind them dogs barked, not near but not distant enough to ignore. The driver urged the horse faster, wheels jolting over ruts, dew forming on Clara's lashes as night deepened. When the first thin light of dawn bled across horizon, they reached a quiet farmhouse where a lantern burned in kitchen window, signal agreed upon by those who risked everything to move justice through shadows. Clara stepped out stiff, legs aching, every muscle buzzing with exhaustion and adrenaline, and as the farmer's wife opened the back door, ushering her inside with rough wool blanket and whispered welcome, Clara paused 1 second on threshold. She looked east, toward Georgia, where her father no doubt paced and raged, where Lydia had been dragged south like a sacrifice to fear, where enslaved families rose again to another day of toil beneath overseers' whips. Her body shook, not from regret but from the immensity of what she had dared, from the terror she would carry like a second spine for the rest of her life, from the knowledge that rebellion cost not only comfort but innocence, safety, belonging. And yet in that breath, as wind rustled corn stalks and dawn birds cried faint hymns, she felt something deeper than fear take hold. A steadiness like stone hauling itself from riverbed, a conviction that she had crossed the threshold of who she was meant to be. She stepped inside, door closing behind her, not as ending but as beginning of a life devoted to bearing witness, to amplifying voices the world forced to whisper, to ensuring that however many years it took, Truth would no longer rot in the soil of silence. History would not name her in textbooks, not in her time, and perhaps never, but she did not act for monuments. She acted so someday, somewhere, a child might wake without chains on wrists or prayers carved from grief, and if her journey vanished into secrecy or sacrifice, the flame she carried would not die, because courage once lit spreads not like wildfire but like seed, quiet and inexorable, surviving even in the harshest soil until one day it blooms where steel once ruled. Clara exhaled, wiped travel dust from her sleeve, lifted her satchel and walked forward, knowing the world she warred against was vast and violent, but knowing too that history bends only when someone chooses at unbearable cost not to bow. Not to bow.